Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. We are on location. We're in Dusseldorf in Germany at the SDN OpenFlow World Congress. And I'm talking with an old friend and oppo of mine because often he plays Sherlock Holmes in our Two-Pint Problem series, but he's here in the same guise but slightly differently today. It's Martin Taylor, the CTO of Metaswitch. Martin, great to see you. You're looking not at all Victorian today. So, all very modern. Let's start with this. There's been a lot of talk about the emergence of the NFV ecosystem, where a couple of years ago or less, no such ecosystem existed. You've watched it with interest and closely from the outset. Where do you think it's at? Is it complete yet?
Oh, nothing like. I mean, a number of the keynote speakers here have talked about NFV as a journey that's going to take maybe 10 years. And we're all, of course, very impatient to see stuff happen, but it is going to take a while. However, I do think probably most of the main players have started to emerge as the likely winners in this changing landscape. The telecom equipment vendors, at least some of them, have kind of told their stories around NFV and how they're going to provide infrastructure and orchestration and open up to third parties. At least some of them have. But then other big vendors coming from the IT side, with experience in cloud and with the hardware that makes up the infrastructure, the servers and the switches and so on, clearly also emerging as very strong players in the infrastructure space. And then, of course, all of the kind of mid to small size network equipment players are talking about offering virtualized network functions, providing products that previously they may have provided as appliances, now as pieces of software to deploy in this NFV infrastructure. So I think the shape is beginning to emerge, and we're seeing who the players are. What we haven't really seen yet, I think, is how telcos will set about buying NFV. Will they purchase and build an NFV infrastructure independently of the virtualized network functions? Or will they kind of revert to more of a kind of service-oriented approach where, okay, we've got to deploy voice over LTE, therefore we need an IMS, an application service, but we want it virtualized, but we want one vendor to provide it all. Which in our view probably will make it hard to realize all the benefits of NFV, but maybe that's more in their comfort zone. So I think that's where we're likely to see the biggest change in the buying behavior of the telcos and how they choose to set about specifying the stuff that they need to build their networks.
Interesting you should say that. I've been talking to quite a few people here at the event, and one of the things that's been said to me, perhaps optimistically, we can discuss it now, but we're on the cusp of the change from using NFV to save money to using NFV to make money. Are we at that point?
I think the business case for NFV will always have a number of factors. I think when NFV first hit the headlines, people's immediate reaction was, well, this commodity or off-the-shelf server hardware, much more bang for the buck than proprietary hardware. So capex hardware savings, seemed like an obvious win. And then, clearly people started understanding the operational savings, deploying new services quickly. Obviously, a lot of talk about reducing time to market for new services, being able to prototype services more rapidly. So, that acceleration of time to market and the ability to experiment with much lower costs, leads you into this idea that telcos can innovate more quickly and potentially offer new services, which could be new sources of revenue. And the automation of operations also allows for a much higher degree of customer self-service. So the idea that consumers or enterprises would be able to go to a portal and essentially buy the services they want and have them automatically provisioned in the network. That is also expected to drive up revenues because it just makes the services more accessible and reduces the friction to getting those services out there and purchased. So I think there's a blend here. I don't think it's a case of saying it's all about new services or it's all about capex. I think the business case has to be a mix of those things.
This is the third event over the past couple of years. The first one was in Darmstadt, 300 odd people not necessarily odd, but you know what I mean. 300 odd people are there. Last year in Bad Homburg, a great many more. This time, a great many more again here in Dusseldorf. 1,300 and turning people away at the doors. You've seen this all the way through, Martin. What do you think has changed in the way that the industry, the vendors, the manufacturers, and indeed the operators, the tier ones, twos, etc., have their expectations of the potential of NFV changed over that period?
I mean, I think the expectations were set out very nicely by the authors of the original white paper, which was published in Darmstadt at this event 2 years ago. And I mean, while the telcos then issued a revised version of that a year later, nothing much fundamentally had changed. It was just a bit more polished and a little bit broader. So I think the picture hasn't fundamentally altered. There's a much greater belief that this is going to happen, and this is terribly important. And that's why this event has doubled in size each of the last 2 years. So it's a huge movement. It's still gathering momentum. I've always said this is the most fundamental transition facing the industry.
Sure.
For 20, 30 years. And I think there's a growing acceptance among everybody concerned that that's absolutely a fair characterization.
You have been talking about, on behalf of Metaswitch, opening up the supply chain and using NFV and SDN. What have you been saying? What were the main points of your thesis in that?
Well, I mean, the main point I think for telcos that we try and make is that they themselves said we want to have access to an ecosystem of innovative, fast-moving, agile software vendors who are by their nature smaller and more nimble, and whose business is more important. The telcos business is more important to them than maybe the really big vendors who have dozens of tier one accounts all calling on their time. And that was all part of the set of benefits that would come out of NFV. That the barriers to entry for smaller vendors into the network are much lower if you haven't got to approve a new piece of hardware, which is a long and onerous and painful process. We constantly remind our customers and our prospects that that's what they said they wanted. Here we are, and and demonstrating the speed and the value and so on that can be achieved with NFV. And we've got some real proof points. I mean, we recently announced a deployment of virtualized SBC with a tier one European vendor, telco rather. And that came about because the incumbent SBC vendor for that telco wasn't able to deliver a product for 3 months or so. And we could deploy a software product in their lab in a matter of days. And we did, and we got the business.
Yeah.
But that network operator was able to get a service out there far more rapidly by virtue of having a virtualized network function by comparison with a traditional proprietary box, QED.
You mentioned the word open, which is of course central to everything that we're talking about. So you mentioned that a couple of minutes ago. Let's go back to that, Martin. How do you think telcos, carriers, service providers, etc., are reacting to the notion of open source as an entry point for NFV and SDN?
I think the rationale for this is that network operators are terrified of being vendor lock-in. I mean, that's the big potential issue here.
Yes.
So obviously, I guess you could say they have felt a degree of vendor lock-in in the past, and
to put it mildly.
Well, I mean, often, of course, they dual source,
yes.
Key parts of the network, but nevertheless, they are then constrained by the roadmaps of those vendors' products as far as their ability to move forward is concerned. So they really want to avoid that, and I think they recognise that if there's vendor lock-in in the NFV infrastructure, that in itself would be a pretty bad thing. So there is a pretty strong emphasis on the infrastructure at least being open source. I think a lot less emphasis on the virtualized network functions being open source, because of course the expectation there is that this is going to be a very open and competitive marketplace.
Yes.
Now, we've chosen to open source one of our virtualized network functions as a, which is the IMS product, Project Clearwater. That's, we did that because we felt it would help get us some attention, and it did. But we expect all other products to continue to be commercial, proprietary software, but running over an open infrastructure, which is dominated by open source components, OpenStack and KVM, and with Intel or x86, or maybe ARM as the kind of de facto standard hardware. So, one can sympathize with this desire to eliminate or at least minimize vendor lock-in, and I think that's where the open source desire comes from.
Now, Metaswitch has very recently joined the Linux Foundation's Open Platform for NFV.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember to say OPNFV, not Open,
OPNFV.
OPNFV.
Yes.
So how do you think that's going to help accelerate the adoption of NFV?
Well, there are a number of pieces of open source software that the NFV world is looking to as kind of key building blocks for for an NFV infrastructure. But they're coming from the general purpose IT cloud environment. And one example, of course, is OpenStack. NFV has some somewhat different set of requirements. I mean, a lot of the requirements are in common, of course, but NFV requires high performance for the data throughput. Ideally, it has some capabilities to manage resources and the inventory of resources and be able to discover what resource capabilities there are in the cloud. Stuff that OpenStack doesn't necessarily do yet. Now, it's possible that community will step up and develop projects that fill those gaps. But the idea of OPNFV is either to help fill those gaps by actually delivering code, or at least create a consensus around what needs to be done, and provide some a community around focusing effort on adapting those open source building blocks to the specific demands and needs of the NFV infrastructure.
It hasn't been around for long, it's very new, but already more than 40 members, so obviously it's hit the right spot somewhere.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, really, everybody that wants to be anybody in the NFV space, is signed up as a founding member, and which I think, is very clear evidence of, the absolute, industry consensus that this is the way to go. There are no standouts. There's no one sitting on the sidelines saying no. NFV is not the right thing to do here. And it represents a big commitment of resources. I mean, there are, a lot of the vendors have signed up, committed developer resources to this, and that will substantially increase the overall community working on these problems, around OpenStack and Open Daylight and the other open source projects that are viewed as being likely candidates for the basis of OPNFV.
A final question to you, Martin, for this particular conversation is this. We've heard a lot in general terms about the agility and other benefits that come by virtue of SDN and NFV, and also its great potential to permit telcos to compete with OTT rivals who have been very hard to compete with for them hitherto. What do you think are the key services and applications that telcos will launch once they are properly enabled by NFV?
I mean, I'm not convinced that there are, fundamentally brand new services. I mean, I think we understand what the universal communication services looks like.
Yeah.
I think there's much greater scope for customization of services to the narrower needs of particular communities or groups of customers. I mean, that's doing everything in software, and virtualizing it means that you can, create separate pools of service capabilities that you can combine in different ways. And it's more sort of permutations and combinations of service capabilities that we probably already know about. But I mean, one good example that we've been talking about a lot recently is hosted business voice. Right now, typically comes out of application servers that are massively multi-tenanted. Every customer of a hosted business voice service is essentially being served from the same server. It's the same homogeneous service everybody gets. Now, while that may make good sense for small, medium enterprise market, larger enterprises may be more demanding, may have more specific needs, may want more control. So what virtualization allows you to do is to instantiate a hosted business voice service just for a single enterprise customer, and then to give them much more control over it than you could possibly give them if it was a shared resource. Now, you simply couldn't do that in a non-virtualized world. It'd be completely uneconomical to have to deploy physical bits of hardware for each customer. But in a virtualized world, it's dead easy.
Thanks, Martin. That's our 21st century look on things. The next time we meet, we'll be in Baker Street again, and back in the 19th century with
Indeed,
the
I look forward to it.
I'll see you then, if not before. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.